Hi, I'm Adam Stone. I'm an independent human rights education advocate. I've been involved with HRE for over 20 years. I've done a lot of organizational work for HRE USA. I was elected to the steering committee in 2013 and then elected again in 2016. So I served a total of 6 years on the steering committee. And during that time, I was the co-vice chair of HRE USA for 2 years, and then the co-chair along with Kirby Edmonds for 3 years after that. I've also done a fair amount of work with the development group for HRE USA, trying to secure funding for us from people and organizations that are sympathetic to our work and that see the value of what we do. But really my main focus during all of the last 20 years or so that I've been doing HRE has been on public policy and advocacy. I wrote an article when I was still in law school called HRE and Public Policy in the United States, Mapping the Road Ahead, which was later published in 2002 in Human Rights Quarterly. And since I've been involved with HRE USA, I've been heavily involved with the policy and advocacy group. And we have focused on a number of different things, but one of the principal ones, and one of the things I would say I'm most proud of as far as my HRE work, has been on working on state standards and engaging different states and decision-making bodies as they consider updating or revising their standards, usually in social studies, but also in history and other areas. And we always want to engage and make sure that they are including human rights and HRE in those standards. And there are many, many ways to do that, as you can see if you've looked at any of our work or looked at any of the state standards where we've done work. But that's something that we've done as a team, and I've been happy to be a part of that team. And frankly, some of the work that we've put forward has been accepted and included in standards in places like California, Colorado, Massachusetts, South Carolina, Nebraska, New Jersey. And that's something that I'm really happy to have contributed to as part of that team. And that was definitely a team effort. Another part of that, being led by Karen Hopkins currently in Washington, D.C., is work engaging the DC public schools as they look to update their standards. And we want to be available as a tool to help them to the extent they want it, to make sure that human rights and human rights education are in there and that reflects DC and its history and its status as a human rights city. As far as why is HRE important, I think that really goes back to when I first started doing human rights education work over 20 years ago. I had been doing work that was sort of more traditional human rights work, just volunteer work as part of the Freedom Writers Network of Amnesty International, and doing letter writing campaigns to governments, trying to seek the release of political prisoners. And that's very important work, and unfortunately that still needs to be done. But as I did research on human rights education, it really clicked for me. And I was looking at the work of the earliest practitioners in the field back then, Nancy Flowers, Christy Redelius Palmer, Felissa Tibbetts, looking at what Loretta Ross was doing in Atlanta, looking at what Shula Koenig was doing with her People's Decade for Human Rights Education. And just reading that research and those practitioner tools, it clicked for me, and I really saw where they were coming from, and I really understood how an ounce of prevention really is worth a pound of cure, which I think that's true with illness, but I think it's also true with something like human rights and human rights violations. So if you have a culture, if you build a culture where people are educated about human rights and they know their rights and they understand that not only their rights but the responsibilities that come with those rights, for themselves, for their communities, for other communities, other nations. If you have that, I think that you can prevent a lot of human rights abuses before they can ever happen. Certainly not all of them, but hopefully some of them. And that is a much more just and equitable and efficient way to do things rather than having to come in after their human rights violations and try to pick up the pieces and try to figure out what justice requires in that situation. So to me, that's why I feel like any organization that's interested in advocating for human rights should be, a part of the human rights education movement, because we can build cultures where there is this profound and deep respect for human rights that has come about in part because people have learned about human rights and responsibilities from their earliest days of schooling, in the formal education sector, in the non-formal education sector, in the labor sector, just all over, throughout life, people learning about human rights can make a difference, and it can build a culture where you're going to see respect for human rights and you're going to have better quality of life for everybody in that culture, and fewer human rights violations and abuses that have to be dealt with later on. And the final thing I would touch on is why I think HRE USA has been so important as a network. Like I said, I've been involved at various levels with it, and since it started, and helping to organize and maintain HRE USA. And I really think the greatest value that it brings is that it is a nationwide network of people doing this very difficult and this very, at times, lonely work. Many of us as human rights education advocates are spread out geographically around the country, and we don't necessarily have somebody we can just go to the coffee shop with and talk about human rights education. But with HRE USA, we do have that. We have that connection, and people can do it in-person gatherings when that's possible, but also Zoom and email. And there are other people out there who value this work, who are giving their blood, sweat, and tears to this work. And that helps, I think, to motivate people and to maintain their interest and their willingness to give to this cause. And again, just going back to the advocacy work I talked about, that was all collaborative. That was all teamwork. And it couldn't have happened without HRE USA, and it couldn't have happened without us, the various people involved, meeting each other, doing telephone conferences, talking by email, and helping each other to put our best feet forward to try and make a difference and to advocate on a very high policy level for changes that could make human rights education more inclusive and more available everywhere in the U.S. So I hope that answers everybody's questions, and thank you, HRE USA, and let's all keep supporting HRE USA. It's made a difference, and it's going to continue to make a difference.